In today's discussion, we want to present four different categories of methodology, meaning four different types of analyses of lumdus, and relate them to the mitzvah of Pidyon Ben and the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The first of the four is when you have a mitzvah that's incumbent upon two people. We'll call them Ruvain and Shimon. But first, we have Ruvain's obligation vis-a-vis himself, and then we have Ruvain's obligation vis-a-vis Shimon. And the question is, are both of these obligations equal? Or is one Ikar and the other is Tofel? Then we have a second methodology, and that is the action and the result of the action, which is called Maisa and Totzas HaMaisa. We have a third approach, a third category, when you have two dinim that look identical, that's what they appear, but yet they are fundamentally different in their essential definition. And finally, category number four, when you find an obligation that's written in scriptures in two different parshios, does that therefore generate two different chiyuvim? So again, in the world of the analysis of Sugyas Hashas, these are very relevant and common categories, and it's kedai to learn them and train oneself over and over again so that one could apply them to new sugyas that he's never learned before and become more proficient in the depths, the analysis of the depths of Torah. So without further ado, let's introduce a Gemara in Kiddushin on Daf Chav Tes that addresses the issue of the mitzvah Pidyon Ben. The mitzvah of Pidyon Ben is incumbent upon the father to be poda his son, who's a bechor le'imo, and he pays 5 sloim to the kohen of his choice. The son is obviously too young to be poda himself. He can't redeem himself. He's a month old. But eventually, in event that his father does not redeem him, he is obligated to redeem himself. So therefore, we can talk about Trei Gavri, two individuals. In this case, we'll call them Ruvain and Chanoch, because Chanoch is the son of Ruvain. They both have an obligation of Pidyon Ben. The father, Ruvain, is obligated to be poda his son, who's a bechor, by the name of Chanoch. That obligation is the first sequentially, chronologically, because the child is only 30 days. But eventually, the child will become responsible to be poda himself in the event that his father wasn't poda him. And that's at the age of bar mitzvah. So now let's fast forward the clock. Now
Can I ask a question, Rabbi?
Sure.
Because it bears on what we did the last couple of weeks. In the case where the child has a Jewish mother but a non-Jewish father, does the obligation fall on the grandfather until the boy hits 13, or is there nobody obligated until the boy turns 13?
So you mean to say the father's father is Jewish and the father is not Jewish?
No. The mother of the child
is
Jewish,
right?
And her father is still alive, the grandfather. But the father of the little boy is non-Jewish.
So your question is whether the grandfather's chayav in Pidyon Ben, or what?
Yes, because
So let's just see. The grandfather was married to a Jewish woman.
And had the daughter who was the mother of the baby.
And she married a non-Jew. So it's the mother's father, and he's Jewish. Would he pick up the chiyuv that normally falls on the father?
That's correct.
I don't think so. I think it only goes to the father, and if not the father, then it falls on Bezdin. But let me get back, on track so that I don't get too distracted because I want to take you in a certain direction. Okay. So now the question is as follows. The father needs Pidyon Aben because he's also a Bechor. The son has to be Poda himself because his father wasn't Poda him. Now the son becomes Bar Mitzvah. So you have two obligations that emerge on two different people for the same mitzvah. Meaning, the father has to be Poda himself because his father wasn't Poda him and he's a Bechor. And yet, he also has an obligation to be Poda his son. And his son generates a chiyuv on his father to be Poda him. So how do we view these two chiyuvim that emerge on the father, one vis-a-vis himself and one vis-a-vis his son? So the Gemara says that although there's a machlokes tanoim, which I don't want to get involved in now, who comes first? Meaning, the father has 10 sloim. Should he first be poda? He should redeem his son, and then with the remaining 5 sloim, he redeems himself, or the other way around. That's machlokes tanoim. But Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says hakol modim. There's no issue that if the father only has 5 sloim in his bank account, which means that's an either-or situation. Either he's poda himself or he's poda his son. So that means if he's poda himself, he won't be able to be poda his son unless he wins the lottery tomorrow. But right now, Basher Usham, he only has 5 sloim. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says that in this case, everybody agrees that he's poda himself, which means that he forfeits, for the time being, the mitzvah of being poda his son, and he gives preference to the mitzvah to be poda himself. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says the reason for that, the underlying logic, he doesn't quote a pasuk, is mitzvah de gufe adif, which literally translates as the mitzvah that's on your own body takes preference over the mitzvah on someone else's body. And since in this case, in this very strange scenario, the father needs pidyon, and that's an obligation vis-a-vis his own body, that's gufe, even though he has 5 sloim total, which means that if he's poda himself, he will not have 5 sloim to be poda himself. Mitzvah de gufe adif. He will use 5 sloim to be poda himself, and in effect, forfeit the mitzvah of being poda his son. Why? Because Omar Rabbi Yirmiyah, and these are the 3 key words for today's discussion, mitzvah de gufe adif. The mitzvah vis-a-vis his own guf takes preference. Joe, I'm willing to entertain questions, but only if it's some zach. Don't ask me questions about grandfathers right now. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering with regards to this concept, because mitzvah the gufa is just a mitzvah on yourself, right? That's how he's
Correct.
Understanding it. But would you not say that you wouldn't necessarily be able to learn out from this to other mitzvahs legufe, because in this situation, maybe the pidyon that you're doing for somebody else wouldn't necessarily be strong if you yourself aren't a poda originally.
I don't think that's the issue.
You understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. I don't think that it has to do with whether you are poda or not poda, you're bechor, you're not a bechor. No, mitzvah de gufe adif, and we're going to have to see how that applies to Talmud Torah, which means that your mitzvah vis-a-vis yourself takes preference over your mitzvah vis-a-vis someone else, even if that someone else is your own son. That's what it says in the Gemara. Now, whether or not we can apply this to Talmud Torah and draw the conclusion that if you have only X amount of funds in your bank account to pay a malamed to teach yourself, meaning the father teaching himself, or to pay that malamed to teach his son, and he can't get one malamed to teach both of them, does the obligation of oneself, meaning the Ruvain has a chiyuv of Talmud Torah vis-a-vis himself, and therefore you'd have to hire the malamed, is that also mitzvah de gufe adif? Rabbi Yirmiyah in the Gemara doesn't address this question. And if we apply Rabbi Yirmiyah's logic by a matter of analogy to Talmud Torah, then Ruvain would hire the malamed to teach himself rather than hire the malamed to teach his son Chanoch. And we're going to put this question now on the side, and Amir Hashem will come back to it in a few minutes. Let's focus on the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben. About 6 centuries ago, a little bit more, there was a Gadol b'Yisrael in the Spanish Jewish community called the Rivash, and he wrote Shuvas, many. He's a prolific Meshiv, and he stells on one particular focus in his tshuva, in particular tshuva about Pidyon Haben, based on his reading of the Rambam. Now, the laws of Pidyon Haben in the Rambam are codified in Hilchos Bikurim. Bikurim is, of course, the first fruits, but they are also, in the context of the first fruits, the Rambam discusses the firstborn son. And there, the Rambam writes, and this is in Perek Yud Aleph Hilchos Bikurim, mitzvahs aseh liftos kol ish Yisrael beno shehu bechor li'imo ha'Yisraelis. That's at the very beginning of Perek Yud Aleph. The Rambam codifies the biblical obligation of the father to be podeh his son. And then if you fast forward 5 halachas later, the Rambam says, Hapodeh es bino, mevarech asher kitshonu mitzvosav v'tzivanu al Pidyon Haben. So please underline the word al Pidyon Haben, if by chance you printed out the pages that David was kind enough to forward to you in the email, because in Hilchos Brachos, the Gemara establishes in Masechta Pesachim that there are 2 different formulations of a Birchas HaMitzvah. Sometimes the Birchas HaMitzvah is with a lamed, and sometimes with an al. So, for example, when I put on my tefillin, I will make a bracha lehaniach with a lamed. Or if I, for example, will check my house for chametz, I will recite a bracha levayer es hachametz. If I am putting on my talis, I'll make a bracha lehis atef bitzitzis with a lamed. However, and I can go on and on. However, there are many other mitzvahs where the Gemara establishes that you make the bracha with an al. Like, for example, al netilas yadayim, al mikra megillah. And in the case of bir chametz, we'll see that the Gemara establishes in that sugya in Pesachim Daf Zayin that under certain circumstances, the bracha will shift from levayer es hachametz to al bir chametz. Now, the Rambam is outspoken about the fact that if Ruvain is being podeh his son Chanoch, he makes a bracha, he recites the bracha Asher Kitshonu Mitzvos al Pidyon Haben with an al. Now, the Rivash quotes another Rambam, which is a Rambam in Hilchos Brachos, and there the Rambam says, no, I'm sorry, it's the same Rambam in Pada Atzmo Mevarech Liftos Habachar with a lamed. So let's just get it straight. When the Rambam addresses the question of the Nusach HaBracha for a father being poda his son, it's al pidyon haben. On the other hand, if the father was not redeemed and he's a bechor by his father, then when he's redeeming himself, he makes the bracha liftos es habechor with a lamed. So the Rivash wants to understand if this is all the mitzvah of pidyon haben, then let's classify it. Does it deserve a bracha with a lamed or a bracha with an al? Why does the Rambam make it dependent on whether he's being poda his son, in which case you get the al, or he's being poda himself, in which case you get the lamed? So it's either al pidyon haben in the case where he's being poda his son, or liftos haben in the case where he's being poda himself. The Rivash wants to understand why. And in order to understand this Rambam, says the Rivash, we go back to the Gemara of Al and Li, and the Gemara says there that if you are a shliach and you're representing someone else, then the bracha shifts from lamed to al. Now keep in mind, please, there are many, many different rules that kick in and govern whether or not it's a bracha with an al or a li. For example, al netilas yadayim, I didn't send a shliach. There is no shlichus for netilas yadayim, and yet the bracha is with an al. Or, for example, netilas lulav, the bracha is with an al, even though there's no shliach. So that's because other rules kick in and shift the bracha from lamed to al. So it should be litolas yadayim or litolas halulav, but it shifts to an al. In that case, there's another rule that it's not over lasiyosan, and the reason why it's not over lasiyosan is because you first pour the water over your hands, and then you make the bracha. Or, for example, in the case of lulav, you first pick up the daled minim, again according to certain rishonim, but almost all rishonim. First you pick it up, and then you make the bracha. So mid'ag be'nafik be means that you are already yotze yochiv, and therefore the bracha now will shift from a lamed to an al. The same will be true in the case of tvila, because a Tomei, or for that matter, a non-Jew who's misgayer, cannot make the bracha when he's Tomei or before he's Jewish, and therefore the bracha will shift to an al. Sher kitshonim it's also al tvila, al tvila. But one thing is crystal clear, that if the bracha is being recited by someone on behalf of someone else, then the bracha shifts to an al. Says the Rivash, the Rambam understood that in this complex mitzvah called pidyon haben, where there are trei gavri, and Reuven is responsible to be poda his son Chanoch, who's now at the ripe old age of 1 month old, then Reuven is representing Chanoch, meaning fundamentally the obligation falls on Chanoch to be poda himself, but since he cannot do so, the Torah sort of shifts it and says to the father, you know what? You're responsible to see to it that your son is redeemed. Now, if it's true that the father, the way the Rivash interprets the Rambam Shita, is obligated not in the Ikar mitzvah, but rather he is representing his son to be poda his son. And that's why the Rambam shifts the bracha from lamed to al, and you make a bracha of al pidyon haben. Whereas if you're being poda yourself, an event that your father was not poda you, the bracha will be with a lamed, because that's your obligation. You're not doing it as a shliach representing or fulfilling the mitzvah on behalf of anyone else. Then what we have to understand is why does the bracha shift from a lamed to an al? And I heard once from my Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik, many, many years ago, when we were learning Masechta Pesachim, that there are two categories of bracha. There's a bracha on the Chovas Gavra, which means that the Torah obligated you in the Maisa mitzvah, and then you make a bracha lamed with a lamed, and then there's a bracha not on the Gavra, but rather on the Kiyum HaMitzvah, on the result of the Maisa. The Maisa is really not yours. You're just an extended arm of the Mischayev, but you can make the bracha because you are creating a situation through your Maisa, which is a Kiyum HaMitzvah. So, for example, in the case of Pidyon Ben, the way the Rivash understands the Rambam, we can now understand why, when you are poda your son, the bracha shifts from an lamed to an al, because the father is not fulfilling his own chovas gavra and maisa mitzvah. His mitzvah is not the maisa pidyon, but rather his mitzvah is to see to it that his son is padui, has been redeemed, which is the kiyum mitzvah, the end zone of the mitzvah, if you follow my point. So the al is on the kiyum mitzvah of bino padui, whereas the lamed is on the maisa mitzvah and the chovas gavra. And herein lies the difference between a father's being poda himself as opposed to a father being poda his son, because we're understanding now that the father being poda his son is not a chovas gavra, and therefore he's not obligated in the Maisa Pidia. He's only obligated to see to it that his son is Padui, which is the Kiyum mitzvah that results from the Maisa, and on that you make a bracha with an al. Whereas, if he, the father, was not redeemed by his father, now he has to redeem himself because he's also a Bechar, then he has a Chovas Gavra, and his Maisa Pidia is the Maisa that he's obligated in, and therefore he will make a bracha with a lamed. And I thought that now that we have this insight of the Rivash, we could go back to the Gemara that we started with of Rabbi Yirmiyah and understand what does it mean mitzvah de gufei adif. That the nafkamina between Ruvain's obligation of Pidyon Ben vis-a-vis himself and Ruvain's obligation to be poda his son Chanoch is that Ruvain, to be poda himself, is a chovas gavra, maisa mitzvah. To be poda his son is only beno padui. Hence, Rabbi Yirmiyah says if he has a choice, he only has 5 slime. He doesn't have 5 slime plus 5 slime. And therefore, if his bank account could only facilitate one single Pidyon Ben, he'll be poda himself first. And not only first, but he won't be poda his son for the time being until he wins the lottery. And the reason for that is because with regard to his son, it's only beno padui. But with regard to himself, it's a chovas gavra of a maisa pedia plus padui, obviously. So that he has 2 chiyuv, and we jack it up, we upgrade it, and that's the chovas gavra that in the language of Rabbi Yirmiyah is called mitzvah de gufei. Gufei means the maisa that you do with your body. So in the case where the father is being poda himself, he's not a representative, he's not an agent or a proxy for anybody else. He's being poda himself. That's his obligation. Do we apply the same logic to Talmud Torah? L'chora, yes. Why not say that Talmud Torah is an identical structure? You have the chiyuv of the father to study Torah vis-a-vis himself. You have the chiyuv of the father to teach his son Torah. If he can only do one and not the other, then mitzvah de gufei adif. but I believe that that's not true. And Rabbi Yirmiyah never applied his logic to the case of Talmud Torah, even though in the Gemara there, the Gemara talks about Talmud Torah as well. But Rabbi Yirmiyah addressed the case of Pidyon Haben. Check me out on that to make sure I'm not mistaken. Now, let me add one more point before we go on to compare this whole structure to Talmud Torah. In Pidyon Haben, there's a gigantic machlokes whether or not the father has to be poda his son after his son becomes bar mitzvah. And according to almost all the Rishonim, he is exempt from that mitzvah. Once the child becomes bar mitzvah, the obligation to be poda the son is on the son himself. The father is now lifted, or shall we say, exempt from that mitzvah. And according to the Rivash, it makes a lot of sense, because the father was never really obligated to begin with. It was not a chovas gavra. He was only in charge of overseeing the beno padui to make sure that his son is redeemed. But if a chovas gavra would emerge, which happens when the ben reaches bar mitzvah age, then there's no reason why the Torah should appoint the father as a proxy to represent the son. The son now has the chiyuv. Once the son has the chiyuv, there's no reason or rhyme to add another chovas gavra to the father. The father never really had a chovas gavra to begin with. Okay, now having said that, let's talk about Talmud Torah. In the case of Talmud Torah, the Gemara establishes that the father's obligation vis-a-vis himself to study Torah is derived from one pasuk. We'll explain that in a minute. Whereas the obligation of the father to teach his son Torah and pay for his Torah education is derived from an entire different parsha, totally different pasuk. So in the case of the father, he has to study Torah because of a pasuk that says, "Ulamadatem osam," you should learn them, "Ushmartem lasosam," and you should observe them. In the case of a father's obligation vis-a-vis his son, it's a totally different pasuk. It doesn't say "Ulamadatem" and you shall study, but it says "Vilimadatem osam espenechem," which we say in Kriyat Shema twice a day. Vilimadatem, teach him. And I'm going to make a gigantic deal out of this. The very fact that there are two psukim that serve to derive from each one a chiyuv, in the one case of ulamadatem, for the father vis-a-vis himself, in the case of the father for his son, vilimadatem, indicates in my mind, and I think it's a tool that can be applied all over Shas, that we're dealing with two different chiyuvim, two different mitzvahs. I'll mention here, which is another discussion, which I'd like to pick up maybe another time, that the Rasag, Rav Saadia Gaon, counts two mitzvahs in Taryag. One mitzvah to study yourself, and the other mitzvah to teach your son. Two different mitzvahs. The Rambam has a different shita based on the Shroshim and Sefer Mitzvahs. He calculates many mitzvahs and combines them whenever they're related to the same end goal, so to speak, the same end zone. But the very fact that the Rasag and other Monei mitzvahs count Lilmod Ulalamid, study and teach, as two separate mitzvahs is basically a result of the fact that there are two separate psukim, two sources in the scripture for each, respectively, for each one of these two chiyuvim. They're two different mitzvahs. But here's the point I want to make. And let's see, you be the jury and tell me if you think my mind is thinking in the right direction. In the case of Pidyon Haben, there's one mitzvah, and that's the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben. That mitzvah is incumbent on the father because his father was not poda him and he's a bechor. That mitzvah is incumbent on the father vis-a-vis his son because the Torah says that the father is responsible for his son's pidyon. When you have one mitzvah, which bounces back in two different directions, it bounces back on yourself and on your son, then you wonder whether or not that mitzvah really primarily, essentially is on the father, vis-a-vis himself, or no, it's also vis-a-vis his son. And the way we're relearning Rabbi Yirmiyah in the Gemara, your primary obligation is vis-a-vis yourself. Your obligation vis-a-vis your son is a secondary obligation relatively, because you're only representing your son insofar as he can't implement that mitzvah. But again, the main point I want to express here is that we're dealing with one mitzvah that's incumbent on the father vis-a-vis himself and on the father vis-a-vis his son. And mitzvah de gufe tells me that the primary chiyuv is vis-a-vis yourself, and that's a chovas gavra with a ma'aseh pidiyah. The chiyuv vis-a-vis your son is, you know what, step up to the plate, because your son is too young to do it, but really the son is the one who's being poda, and once the son becomes a gadol, the father's off the hook. In baseball, we call it the on-deck circle, or the bullpen for the pitchers. I don't know, in hockey, what's, who's next on line? No, okay, so we'll use baseball. Half of the American language is baseball. Anyway, by the way, after the Shia, I want you to tell me what's going on in Canada, because I don't believe any of these news reports. They blow everything up, but it doesn't sound very good. And I'm not sure if it's better than England or worse than England or Spain and one country after the other. But getting back to our discussion, what I want to know here is, when you have two different mitzvahs that are derived from two different psukim, and we're going to try very hard to define how they're fundamentally different one from the other. So you have one chiyuv for yourself to learn Torah, another chiyuv to see to it that your son is taught Torah. At this point, you can't say mitzvah de gufei odif. The whole principle logic of Rabbi Yirmiyah cannot apply here, because your obligation to teach your son is a primary obligation that stands on its own, independently derived from its own pasuk. There's no reason to say that that's not a chovas gavra with an obligation to the ma'aseh mitzvah of teaching your son. Do you follow what I'm saying? When you have one mitzvah, you could say, well, your primary obligation is to do that mitzvah for yourself. And, the Ben should be doing it for himself, but he can't do it. So the Torah sort of, shifts it over to the bullpen, to the on-deck circle, and then, let the father fill in, let him step up to the plate. But if it's two separate chiyuvim, then why in the world should I say mitzvah de gufei if they're both mitzvah de gufei? There's a mitzvah de gufei to study your own Torah, and there's a mitzvah de gufei to teach Torah to your son. Or, if you cannot do so, to set up a malamed, and you are in effect teaching your son Torah. Why would I begin to say that one is primary and the other is just a fill-in? Just step up to, step into the shoes of your son. No. Your obligation as a father is to teach your son Torah. And I want to go a step further. Even after your son becomes bar mitzvah, you still retain the obligation to teach your son. The Torah doesn't say, but if they're gedolim, you don't have to teach your son, and that's it. No. Because here we're dealing in Talmud Torah with two independent obligations. Both are chiyuvim, derived each one from a different pasuk and imposed upon the father. It's incumbent upon the father to study Torah, and it's incumbent on the father to teach his son Torah. There's no mitzvah de gufei odif here. And therefore, I want to derive the conclusion that if the father has only enough funds for paying a malamed to teach himself or paying a malamed to teach his son, then we have to operate within a whole different realm here, with new rules and new regulations that are rooted in the laws of Talmud Torah, to try to figure out who comes first. but not based on Rabbi Yirmiyah's mitzvah de gufei odiv, because as I said, we're talking about two mitzvos, two independent chiyuvim, two parshios in the Torah, each of which impose, respectively, a chovas gavra on the father. So at this point, I ask myself, what law or what lumdus in Hilchos Talmud Torah would give me the right to come to the conclusion that the father's obligation vis-a-vis himself, that's called hu kodem libno, comes before his son? And I believe that the answer to that question is rooted in the very essential difference as we define these two mitzvahs. The mitzvah incumbent on the father is ulamadatem osam ushmartem lasosam, meaning the ultimate goal of the father's obligation to study Torah is ushmartem lasosam, because ein amoritz chassid, you can't fulfill the Torah unless you know the Torah. So the entire enterprise of Shmiras HaMitzvos now depends upon Talmud Torah. In the case of the father teaching his son, he doesn't have to teach his son how to do mitzvahs. That's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan called chinuch, but not on a d'oraisa level. He has to transmit the Torah. He has to guarantee that there's another generation, and after the transmission of the Torah to his son will in turn transmit the Torah to his son ad infinitum. But the Rambam writes, hu kodem libno, and then quotes the pasuk l'madatem osam ushmartem lasosam, and he writes, Deha Talmud kodem l'maisa b'chol makom. Talmud comes first, because there's no maisa without Talmud. Gadol Talmud maybe lidei maisa. It doesn't say the opposite of Gadol maisa maybe lidei Talmud. First you start with Talmud, and then you get to maisa. So if the essence of the enterprise of Talmud Torah is maisa ushmartem lasosam, then the mitzvah to teach yourself Torah, which is for the purpose of ushmartem lasosam, takes precedence. And in event that there's not enough money to both hire a malamed for yourself and hire a malamed for your son, you will hire a malamed for yourself, but not because of mitzvah de gufe. As we said before, both the chovas ha'av vis-a-vis his son and the chovas vis-a-vis himself, they're both mitzvah de gufe. They're both a chovas gav. But when it comes to Hilchos Talmud Torah and the mitzvah Talmud Torah, we're going to give preference to that aspect of Talmud Torah that's ushmartem lasosam, which is the father's obligation. The son is too young for that obligation. The obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son is the broader Torah. It's not limited to ushmartem lasosam, because as I said before, we don't have to get into this now, that comes under a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, a takana of chinuch, but rather teach the son Torah because he is the next link in the transmission of Torah from one generation to the next generation. Okay, Rabbosai, this is what I wanted to suggest. Let me just give a very quick and short synopsis. And what we're saying is that we only apply the principle of Rabbi Yirmiyah of mitzvah de gufei adiv in the case of Pidyon Haben, and maybe there are other cases, but not in the case of Talmud Torah, because in Pidyon Haben we're dealing with one single mitzvah. And based on the Rivash, we come to the conclusion that mitzvah is primarily vis-a-vis oneself. In the case of a 30-day-old tat, the Torah gave, so to speak, the responsibility over to the father, but really the father is representing the son, So the father Visvi himself has a chovas gavra, which is called in Rabbi Yirmiyah's language mitzvah de gufe, whereas vis-a-vis his son, he's only representing his son for beno podui, but he doesn't have the chovas gavra and the mitzvah de gufe, and therefore mitzvah de gufe adifa, he will use the 5 slum that he has in his bank account to be pod himself. But if we have a situation where the father is obligated vis-a-vis himself and vis-a-vis his son as 2 independent primary chiyuvim, chovas gavra, both, or shall we say respectively, derived from 2 different parshios, then those 2 chiyuvim impose on the father a chovas gavra. We cannot give adifus and preference to one over the other based on Rabbi Yirmiyah's mitzvah de gufei adif, but rather we have to find an inner mechanism to see why the father will fulfill the mitzvah vis-a-vis himself or the other way around. And we came up with a theory that when it comes to the father's obligation, it is a precondition in fulfilling the mitzvah lishmar v'lasos, and that takes primary, that takes preference. Okay, then we're going to stop here, and the mitzvah Hashem, next week we can, I think, well, let's see, Wednesday night is Yom Tov. Did I get that right? Well, Thursday night is Yom Tov.
Thursday night is Yom Tov.
Thursday night is Yom Tov.
Yeah.
So
Wednesday was still good.
So you let me know, if you want to hear shir on Wednesday night. I want to take this one step further, and finish it up. Okay, then have a great week. And the last week of the Omer, I don't want to count it because it's getting late over here, but have a great week in the end of the Omer, leading up to Kabbalah Sattov.